After a series of very mysterious circumstances, a man would fall from a plane, and the question became, who was the Paducah plane jumper? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Paducah plane jumper. Viewer discretion is advised. This might be a shorter video. I'm not 100% sure. I was looking at for information on a totally unrelated story, but it was about a skydiver, and I somehow found my way into this story, which apparently was covered on Unsolved Mysteries, but I do not recall this story at all, but I just thought it was really interesting. So the story takes place in Paducah, Kentucky. It was September 30th, 1991 at approximately 6 p.m. A man walks onto the Barkley Regional Airport there in Paducah, Kentucky, and this man met someone who worked there named Wes Weaver. According to Wes Weaver, this unknown man who had walked onto the airport asked if there was a plane he could get on, and Wes is like, no. And then the man asks, well, is there a pilot here I can speak to? And then Wes answers, no, not right now, there isn't. The stranger then says, here, you can have my jacket if I could get on a plane that might be flying out here soon. I'm not sure if he felt the jacket was of some sort of value, but that is what he offered. But Wes Weaver still said no. And if, at this point you're becoming kind of this is harassment almost, or loitering. And so he was like, you gotta leave the property at this point. And so the stranger does in fact walk away. Something that Wes Weaver would point out is that this man did not appear intoxicated. He did not appear to be on any kind of drugs. He wasn't talking in any kind of paranoid way. He wasn't rushing anything. He didn't seem like he was in like distress. He seemed completely normal, just asking odd questions about getting on a plane quickly. 30 minutes goes by. Wes Weaver now gets into a truck, and he is now driving outside of the airport, I guess to the side of it. And as he's going down the road, he sees the man, the stranger, walking along the fence that basically prevents people from getting into the airport from that part of it. And then he looks in his mirror, Wes does, and he sees the stranger jumping over the fence just quickly. He just out of nowhere just bolted over the thing, jumped over barbed wire and everything. And then Wes saw him running. And so Wes calls in on the radio, hey, there's a guy running on the runway, go get him. There were then two other witnesses, Linda Lieb and her husband, Jerry Lieb. Both of them would later tell police that they saw this man running very fast along the runway. Now, at that point, there was a plane, the Northwest Airlines Flight 2940, that was taking off from the airport heading to Memphis, Tennessee. Now, this plane, it took off just before sunset at 6:49 p.m. The plane was cleared for takeoff, and it began its journey down the runway. Now, nobody saw the man jump onto the plane. However, it is very clear that this stranger who had been running down the runway had gone onto the plane. They believe that he jumped onto the wing of the plane and just held on for dear life. About 60 seconds goes by when all of a sudden, one of the witnesses who saw the man running across the runway saw from the plane that is now about 300 feet up in the air, this little thing, because it's from a distance, this little thing just sort of falling very quickly and landing on the ground below. The plane continued on its path, and there was no issues happened with the plane. So they contact not only the airport security, but they also contact the police, because this might have been someone falling out of the plane. And they begin to search the entire property when they come across this one of the big long chain link fences. And as they pull up to it, they can see some very obvious damage to the fence. And when they get closer, they see a person. A man had landed on this fence. And so now they knew that thing that fell out of the plane was a person. And it landed on the fence below, killing him instantly. Wes Weaver would indicate to everyone that this was the man. This was the stranger that had been trying to get on a plane that everyone saw running across the runway. It's him. The man was now wearing the bomber jacket that he had tried to offer as payment for a plane. The man was wearing an expensive pair of running shoes. He had on 2 pairs of blue jeans. He had on a blue knit jogging jacket, a green sweater, and a brown shirt. He was also carrying a Sony Walkman. The man's cause of death was obvious to everyone. But when they did a toxicology test, they fully expected to find drugs and alcohol in his system. There were none. He was completely clean. The man's body, the coroner would notate, was incredibly tanned, and there were no tan lines. He had his pubic area shaved, and it told them that this man was some sort of potentially an athlete. Or they also suspected he may have been a Chippendales dancer, because the Chippendales were there a few days prior to this happening, but they confirmed with them that this man was not a part of their group. So maybe he is some sort of athlete, like a swimmer or something like that, because they did find a pair of swimming goggles inside of his jacket. Sewn into the collar of the jacket was a military ID tag inscribed Lieutenant L.F. Price, USAF. However, when they checked with the military records, there was no one of that name that had been in service prior or currently. Something they also found, just crazy coincidence, is that this man had roughly 90 seconds to get from the road where Wes had seen him to jump over the fence, sprint down the runway, and manage to jump onto a plane that's already moving down the runway. But he did it. Now, again, nobody saw him jump onto the plane, and nobody can say that they saw him fall off of the plane. The pilot didn't see him or hear him or anything, but it is more than obvious that he fell from this plane. They just don't know if he was clutching onto that wing and the 100+ mile an hour winds knocked him off because there's no handholds on the wing, or was his goal to get up in the air on any kind of airplane and then jump from it. He had no parachute on him. Was this an attempt to end his own life in a really extravagant way? Or was he running from something, trying to get somewhere desperately? They don't know. The stranger would be buried in a John Doe gravesite, and it remained a John Doe gravesite for about 7 or 8 years. Then, in 1997, a woman in Ohio had been watching a rebroadcast of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, and her name was Duecker. Based on the description of the man shown in the episode, the woman believes that the man in question was her missing stepson, 28-year-old marathon runner named Brian Stanley Duecker. He had last been seen by his family on September 26, 1991, and that's when his sister visited him in his Cincinnati, Ohio apartment. She would later recount that her brother was hastily cleaning his apartment when she went over there. He appeared to be incredibly irritated. He was preoccupied, couldn't focus. He couldn't really respond to her questions. He seemed just sort of in a different place mentally. So the sister ends up calling their father because she's like, I'm concerned about Brian. Something just feels wrong with him. The father, Jerry, goes to his apartment the following day, but when he gets there, Brian's not there. But they were able to access the apartment, and they found Brian's ID. He left behind a handwritten will and, I guess, a note for the family. The note mentioned that he wanted to head west to go mountain climbing, and this was something he did. I mean, he would go on unannounced trips often, and so this wasn't really surprising to them. But typically Brian returned within a couple of days, but in this instance he did not, and he didn't contact anyone either. They tried to reach out to him again a couple of days later, still nothing, and so they're very worried now, and so they report Brian missing. And so once the sister sees the Unsolved Mysteries episode, she contacts the authorities there in Paducah. She describes her brother, and they're like, no, that doesn't sound like our guy. Doesn't sound like him at all. But the thing is they actually had an autopsy photo of Brian, and they had put that image in a newspaper. And so once the sister saw the newspaper, they're like, no, that's him. That's my brother. That's Brian. And so they sent a photo of Brian that they had to the coroner who did the autopsy, compared it to the images he took of the victim, and they were the same person. And then they also had, I guess, Brian's fingerprints were in the system for some reason. And so they compared those fingerprints to the man's fingerprints, the Paducah jumper, and lo and behold, confirmed. It's him. The man that was acting very strange that day, who jumped onto a plane on a runway and fell from that plane 300 feet, was in fact Brian Duecker. He was 28 years old at the time. So according to the family, when he was 22 years old, Brian had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, which is something his mother also had suffered from. The family was trying to put him into hospitals to get him care. He would literally ask them and hound them and beg them to not put him into some kind of psych ward. He also did not want to be on just a whole treasure trove of medications. Because of all of that, he was unable to land a job. He just couldn't do it. And anytime he got a job, he would be fired or would quit within a very short time. He began to tell people that he felt he was being followed by someone. He was having issues with separating reality from fiction, and just his imagination running wild. Things he was saying were happening weren't actually happening. People who were there weren't actually there. And so that would explain potentially why he was acting strangely to the airport employee on the day this all happened. But they don't know ultimately what his goal was. They don't know if he intended to get on that plane or any plane just to jump. If he was doing it for that reason, he could have gone to a building or anything like that. So why the plane? Why was he so hell-bent on getting on a plane? Was he really trying to get somewhere and no one was listening to him? And, for whatever paranoid thoughts he may have had, maybe. They just don't know. It probably had everything to do with his mental state of mind at that point, but they don't know what was going through his head. They don't know what he felt, what he thought was happening, or what was going on. And it's just sad. I know his family tried to have him put into a hospital, but he's also an adult who can deny that. And so it's not really their fault. They tried. He wasn't ever posing a threat to himself or to others around that time he was diagnosed and kind of in the years following. And so there was no reason for someone to force him into an institution. But by September of 1999, they finally had found their loved one. And the people of Paducah, Kentucky, finally got to find out who this strange man was. So Brian's family would end up leaving him buried at Paducah because they felt that for 7 or 8 years, Paducah residents had become like surrogate family. They, gave him this really nice grave marker. They brought flowers to his grave all the time before everyone knew who he was. And now that they know who he was in his situation, nothing's really changed. I mean, they still go there to mourn. It's just a really bizarre series of events. No one, like I said, no one's really at fault with this. People tried to stop him at the airport. They tried to get security. The family had tried to get him help over the years. This is just one of those stories where, unfortunately, he slipped through the cracks, basically. It's a sad story. I wish somehow he was able to get the help he really needed. But in the end, he didn't physically harm anyone other than himself. And so it's just a tragedy. It really is. It's not the type of story you hear often. I just thought it was I never heard of it before, and I just thought it was a really interesting story. And so justice doesn't need to be served in this case. But thankfully, the Paducah plane jumper now has a name, Brian Stanley Duecker, and he is now resting in peace. But that is it for this case, True Crime of Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, if you're new here, hello, my name is Mike. I tell true crime stories here on YouTube, obviously. So please subscribe if you like that kind of thing. Hit that bell so you're notified of when I post new videos. Drop a comment, leave a like so more people can see the videos. I also tell short form true crime stories over on TikTok. The link to my TikTok is in the link tree, which is in the description of this video below. Feel free to follow that if you want to. I do post compilation videos, though, as well from my TikTok page over here on YouTube once a month. Also in that link tree below, you'll see my case list. It is definitely accessible for you guys to look through. It's in alphabetical order for the most part. You can also search on that document. But if there's a case that you do not see on that list, just send me a really quick email if you would like me to cover it. I just need to know the name of the case, where it happened, and when it happened, and I'll add that name to my list. I do pick my cases I cover at random. But if you are a loved one who is directly connected to a case that's unsolved, cold case, missing persons, please let me know in the email that you are a direct family member because I can make sure those cases get a higher priority. But That is it for this video, True Crime Marooney. So until the next case, ta-ta for now.